Hello and welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. I am live in Copenhagen, Denmark, because in today's video, we're going to talk about the economic future of Denmark. They're famous mainly for their Nordic Model, which combines a relatively free market for businesses with a very highly redistributive social welfare state on the individual level. However, given the changes in demographics and economic trends and globalization, is this model sustainable in modern times? And then I'm going to break it down in this video, and I will show you some highlights of my trip to Denmark in the process. Without further ado, let's get started. People with left-wing political views around the world worship the idea of Scandinavia and how the Nordic model is the way that you can have socialism and extremely generous welfare systems work in a modern free market globalized economy. Well, first of all, there's a lot of flaws to this premise. And second, the Nordic model, as a lot of people have stereotyped it to be, broke down a long time ago. First, let's challenge the idea of Denmark being a socialist country. In fact, really, the former prime minister
that some people
Denmark
in Nordic model with some sort of
debunked it
socialism.
himself.
Therefore, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. The Nordic model is an expanded welfare state which provides a high level of security for its citizens. But it is also a successful market economy with much freedom to pursue your dreams and live your life as you wish.
Yeah, I think you put it pretty well, especially since the reforms that all these Scandinavian countries had in the early to late 1990s, that they are free market economies in the sense that they allow private industry to exist. They have a lot of lax rules about competition and regulations in terms of how businesses can operate and compete both on the local level and internationally. However, while it's free in terms of a regulatory framework and a competitiveness framework, it is not so free for the individual in the sense that they have very high taxes that pay for very generous social safety nets. Denmark, for example, is the highest tax burden in terms of tax revenues, a percentage of GDP of any country in the world at over 55% of their total economy. France is second, and not too far behind France are the other Scandinavian countries of Sweden, Norway, and Iceland, and Finland. However, Sweden has been recent years made an effort to make itself more competitive, but I'll be discussing that in a video I do about them that's going to come out shortly. This series is going to be split into two parts. The first part is going to be where I discuss here in the economic future of Denmark is how the Nordic model works, and the second part, which I'm going to be doing as part of the economic future of Sweden, I'm going to discuss how Scandinavian countries are reacting to global pressures to become more economically competitive, because the flaws of the Nordic model have been very apparent since the 1970s, and the choice these countries have to do is either scale it down or find some way to keep the social safety nets, which have become a source of national pride for these countries, without losing their economic competitiveness. So let's first start with what is the Nordic model, to be exact. The Nordic model really is the idea of having a very free market economy in terms of business and property rights. It's very easy for companies to operate in Denmark, whether it's international companies or domestic companies. They have strong property rights in terms of real estate holdings, business asset holdings, liquid, publicly traded stocks and bonds, and other private sector assets. And they have relatively low regulations on things such as consumer protection, licensing requirements, other sorts of burdensome regulatory compliance. However, they pay for that really which is why it's famous as perceived to be leftist paradise, through having very high taxes and a very generous welfare state. This includes public pension plans that cover most public sector and private sector workers, very high levels of social security payments, They have university, which is completely free, and in fact, many Scandinavian countries outright subsidize living costs too, so that students do not have to work while they are in college. Uh, they have very generous maternity and paternity leaves, and in fact, I think Sweden and Denmark have recently passed laws to have paternity leave for grandparents too. They have low levels of political corruption. They have very democratic societies in terms of what is put up to vote and how transparent their elections are. They have very generous sick leave programs and disability programs, particularly for those over the age of 40 years old. And all of this provides a sense of security for people who live in these countries that, like, if things really go bad, the government really has their back. And they pay high taxes, but they feel like at least they're getting a lot out of it in terms of basic social protections and paying for critical living expenses such as education and most notably universal socialized medicine, which is very prominent across these Scandinavian countries. Why do I say that the Nordic model is at risk or it's already broken down? It sounds great on paper the way I explained it, and maybe the progressives in San Francisco are right and we should just adopt this in the US and pretty much everywhere. Well, there's a few problems and there's also a few societal assumptions that the Nordic model is dependent on. The first main problem is that it stunts ambition. The idea of the tall poppy syndrome or the Prozac effect, where basically a society has collectively agreed that we just cut off the top to keep social harmony, is really a Danish idea from a cultural idea called the Law of Janke, which wasn't a formal law, but it was this cultural idea that individuals' success, individuality, ambition, and creative endeavors that make you stand out are to be frowned upon. And there are like several like sub-rules, such as you're not allowed to think you're special, you're not allowed to think you're as good as you are, you're not allowed to think you're smarter than anybody else. You can't imagine yourself to be better than the collective. You're not allowed to think you know more than anybody else, or that you're more important, or that you're exceptionally good, and you can't laugh at people under you. And you're not to think that anybody actually cares about your individuality, and that you can't really teach us anything. The Janters really, like, there's an extreme view, but a lot of this kind of just drilled down in the culture, and really that people who try to shine and thrive ahead makes it look like they're fronting and standing and making everybody else look bad. And a lot of their culture historically has been about trying to keep social harmony and collective and then punishing people to get ahead. And in economics, this means extremely high levels of taxation and using that taxation to keep the floor relatively high. So you see in these countries like restaurant workers making middle-class job wages that for North American standards, whereas a lot of business executives or startup founders or upper management companies are making maybe less than 5 times the amount of a restaurant worker, whereas in America, those higher level jobs are making usually at least 10 times the amount of a restaurant worker. So that's just kind of an example of how it plays in the economy. Also, this "you're not above anybody else" is how explains partially their culture of trade unions and how unions are very strong, and collective bargaining is basically how wages are dictated. Trade union density in Iceland is over 90%. Over 2/3 of workers are affiliated with a major union in Denmark, and 65% in Sweden, 58% in Finland, and half of Norwegians. And this strength of the unions, paradoxically, is why certain countries like Sweden don't even have a minimum wage, because the unions do the job of negotiating for them so they don't have to legally protect workers with a floor. The other problem really with this is that it creates brain drain. Sure, most people who want comfortable lives love this system because they don't have to work too hard and they can enjoy like a middle class lifestyle. However, those who want to be great and have major success and live a better lifestyle than their peers move. Like I know one example, most of the European students I knew who study abroad in America came from one of the 4 Scandinavian countries, particularly in the entrepreneurship program I took in my undergrad. Literally all the international students were either from India or the 4 Scandinavian countries, because they seem to be the ones who are the most interested in entrepreneurship, and you see the ambitious entrepreneurial types historically, this is changing now with improved startup cultures, have migrated to more business-friendly countries, most notably the United States, the United Kingdom, Singapore, Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, etc. When I lived overseas when I visited a lot of these financial low tax centers, the most common expats really that I saw were Danish, believe it or not. And this is an anecdote, but it reflects just a broader problem in terms of keeping people there. And even with their startup culture, they have built a decent startup culture, but most Danish companies, once they get a certain size, are sold to international competitors because the tax burden and the competitive structure of Denmark and how expensive wages are, again, given because of how high taxes are, force these companies to, when they want to grow, to move out of Danish borders. The other problem is that it encourages a lot of more lazy behavior, for a lack of a better term. The idea, for example, of being able to live while you're at school without having to have the government pay for your living expenses encourages a lot of what I call Van Wilders. I don't know if people have seen that movie, but Van Wilder was this 25-year-old super senior in college who just stayed for 7 years because he was having so much fun. I haven't really been able to find numbers to confirm it, but I have a lot of anecdotes too of increased rates of Van Wilderism, whether it's staying longer for undergrad or getting masters that they otherwise would not need or pursue just so that they could enjoy the college life longer, because once they work, they're going to be paying 40+%, even on the lower tax brackets of their income. So it's like, I might as well enjoy my fun in college versus I'm in no hurry to get into the working world where I'm going to pay most of the money to the state anyway. Because Scandinavia is regarded as a progressive tax country, but it's in terms of the level of progressiveness, like the gap between the lowest tax brackets and the highest tax brackets is actually relatively flat. Middle class people are paying well over 40% of their income in Denmark and other Scandinavian countries, where they're paying half of that in the United States. And so whereas the high tax brackets are high, they're close to 60%, but the gap between the top tax brackets in other developed countries is a lot narrower than the median income earner in other developed countries. And that disincentivizes people to work. And a lot of reforms that have been made in Denmark have been to be more strict about the use of sick leave and disability and other benefits, because you're seeing increased people trying to take advantage of the kindness of the Nordic model. The other big assumption built into the Nordic model, which is I think the main risk of it breaking, is the level of social trust required to operate it. Back when these were instituted during the Great Depression, there were a lot of people legitimately struggling because there just weren't really many jobs anywhere in the developed world due to the Great Depression. And these countries had a Lutheran-based ethic that everybody had to do their share no matter what their ability was. It was just kind of the biblical and moral thing that everybody help each other out. And these are also very ethnically and culturally homogenous countries where everybody's not literally related, but figuratively related. They have a sense of almost family-like solidarity. The very small populations, too, and very abundant levels of natural resources per capita. Denmark is energy independent, especially since the discovery of oil reserves in the North Sea of the post-World War II era. And it will remain that way till at least 2050. And with green initiatives that Denmark has done in terms of solar and wind and other ways to reduce energy consumption, it could be energy independent indefinitely, even as the North Sea reserves get depleted. And it's a similar story in other Scandinavian countries, which have relatively low electricity costs, and they are all exporters of natural resources outside of energy. So low population density, lots of natural resources per capita, so a lot of social solidarity and cultural homogeneity. It makes it the idea of everybody working together and helping each other out and paying higher taxes for the better of the community a lot easier of a sell. However, in recent decades, the social contract underlying the Nordic model is breaking down. First, Scandinavian countries are a lot more secular than they used to be. Even though maybe a small majority still nominally claim to be Lutheran, the inherent values and the lifestyle that these people actually live on a day-to-day basis and the implied values are no longer really reflect that. And there's a lot of disagreements there. And so as a result, people don't really have the same feel that they need to chip in or have some sort of moral obligation beyond what is written in the legal code to participate in this system of collaboration. The other thing is immigration. These countries used to be pretty much 100% native. Now you have up to 20%, about 20% approximately, and it varies between each country, with Sweden being the highest at about 20% of its population being foreign-born, 18% for Norway, 13% for Denmark, and a little bit less for Iceland, and a little bit more for Finland. I'll have the exact numbers in a little graphic that's going to pop up here. But since these countries are no longer homogenous, the idea that I'm going to work hard and pay all of my taxes, not for my fellow Swede or Norwegian or Dane or Finn to get all of these benefits, or my future family, especially since these people are having less kids and a lot of them are childless, it isn't their families anymore. Instead, it's going to be going to immigrants. And immigrants' children, people from different cultural or ethnic backgrounds, they don't really have any sort of patriotism for the country they've just moved to. They don't have the shared history, the shared religion, the shared hardships that built the country through the centuries. They just like, hey, look, I get all this free stuff, and I get to rely on the taxpayers of people who I have no personal ties to. And because of that lack of connection and solidarity, it's become increasingly politically unpopular, the Nordic model. And so there's a lot of parties on the right that have been rising up and have been cutting it back. And then also there's just a financial problem. Like when you have your government spending well over half of GDP and you've had a lot of sovereign debt to pay for a lot of it, the business model's kind of broke, and that's what caused financial crises in Sweden and a lot of other Scandinavian countries in the 1990s. And then the inflation of the 70s was higher in a lot of these countries because they had more inefficient governments to pay for. And naturally, because governments run a lot of services more inefficiently than the private sector, there was a lot of bloat in the public sector, and that ended up being passed down through either higher taxes or inflation, and these economies became less competitive. So over the last 30 years, the Nordic model isn't really as generous as it was in the past. Like the peak level of the Nordic model in terms of its prevalence and how socialized the economies were in Scandinavia was in the 70s. And a lot of the reason they were able to do that, particularly Sweden, because it was a neutral country during World War II, and it wasn't nearly as damaged as much as other countries, and so they never lost their manufacturing capacity. And as the rest of Europe needed to rebuild, the Nordics were able to export a lot of natural resources to the more war-torn areas to help them rebuild. And then that went away, obviously, and so they had to adjust in other ways to become more competitive. So what is Denmark doing about this? Denmark wants to keep its Nordic model. The people generally have no real interest in lowering their taxes and lowering their government spending and being more in line with, say, the UK or the US in terms of its economy. But they realize that the sustainability of that, given a lot of other trends in their society, was not viable. So Denmark really has responded with a way of just being a lot tougher on immigration and means testing benefits more aggressively, especially for immigrants. Denmark also has been doing a good job in promoting its national champion companies. And they believe if they can grow some of their really big companies that are already well established in Denmark and have proven to be internationally competitive and give them the fuel to advance more, then perhaps the growth of Denmark's mega caps will be enough to make up for the fact that the average citizen is retiring and becoming less productive. And we've seen some results with this. Like Denmark has some of the most successful companies in the world. They have 4 Fortune 500 global companies, Maersk Group, which is a major shipping company, the Energy Denmark Group in energy trading, DSV, which is another major logistics company, and of course Novo Nordisk, who is the inventor of Ozempic, which is the weight loss drug that is just revolutionizing obesity. But it's not really just those. There are a lot of other major powerhouse companies in Denmark. Famous examples would include Danske Bank, Nord in the financial sector, Echo, who makes a lot of shoes. I used to like wearing their drivers a lot, despite my friends and family calling them quite ugly. They also have Legos, is based from Denmark, and Carlsberg, the Blue Ring Company. Like I always like do with the economic futures videos, I like to compare the country that we are talking about with a U.S. state. And Denmark actually has a state that is actually pretty close in terms of both the size of its economy and population, also very similar in terms of climate and culture. And for Denmark, this case, we are comparing it to the great state of Wisconsin. Yeah, the University of Wisconsin Badgers also happen to have the same color scheme as the country of Denmark. And they're both pretty far up north geographically. They have large Scandinavian populations. Wisconsin's not the outright majority, of course, like Denmark, but Wisconsin does have a sizable Danish and Scandinavian population. And they both have really nice to enjoy summertime water sports. Wisconsin has the coasts of Lake Michigan and Lake Superior, and Denmark is positioned in the North Sea and Skagerrak and the Baltic Sea. But let's go into some of the facts. The population-wise, they're both about 5.9 million for Denmark and Wisconsin. GDP in nominal terms is also very similar. You've got 410 billion for Denmark and 414 billion for Wisconsin. Nominal GDP per capita is also very similar, 68,898 for Denmark, 70,569 for Wisconsin. I'd argue that the average Wisconsinite probably lives a much higher standard of living than the average Dane. The floor is far lower in Denmark due to social protections, but Wisconsin has a lot more space. Wisconsin has cheaper housing prices relative to wages. Wisconsin has much higher after-tax income due to lower taxes. And the cost of living in the Midwest is fairly affordable, and for relatively low-skilled jobs, it pays fairly high. Notable exports, they're both dairy powerhouses. Denmark, particularly known for Danish butter and creams, and Havarti cheese, which I like a lot on my French dip sandwiches. And Wisconsin is known for its cheese too, Wisconsin cheddar, and it also is known as a big exporter of machinery. Manitowoc construction cranes are from Wisconsin. Kohler, which likes a lot of the bathroom equipment, and a variety of other major manufacturing companies. Johnson Controls, another one operating out of Wisconsin. And then you've got, in terms of Denmark, their most notable exports are also a lot of heavy manufacturing and shipping, but the most famous ones for international audience are, of course, Legos, Ozempic, and dairy products. And have I been there? That's the last question. And the answer for both of these is yes. I've been to both Denmark and Wisconsin. I went to Wisconsin in 2022, and I went to Denmark just a few weeks ago in August of 2024. And I have been sprinkling pictures of my time throughout Denmark throughout this video. And if I end up doing the fan meetup, you'll see some highlights of that too. But yeah, here's just a slide really comparing my time in Denmark, in Copenhagen, versus Wisconsin, where I went to Green Bay and saw a Packers preseason game, because that's only the time where the weather is warm enough that I'd actually want to hang out in Green Bay, Wisconsin at night. Overall, Denmark is a good example of the Nordic model. It's worked for a long time, but a lot of the underlying assumptions and of social trust required to operate the Nordic model are at risk. I mentioned that in a video that I did about declining social trust, and the Nordic model really only works in high trust societies. And so how Denmark is trying to maintain its high trust societies is being stricter on people who try to freeload off the system, and also restricting immigration, because immigration, especially in large amounts from cultures that are really opposed to the local culture, tends to breed a lot of social distrust. Let me know your thoughts. Do you think that the Nordic model can hang on simply just by reducing immigration, or is it going to take a lot more serious reforms for Denmark to remain competitive? And in my next video, in the economic future of Sweden, I'm going to talk more about how Sweden can be an example of how Nordic countries can keep their model, or at least the social protection part of it, while still remaining a competitive global economy. Thanks for watching.